200 species go extinct each day. In recent years, since I began questioning what it means to be human, increasingly I'm meeting seemingly sane people who have little or no respect or reverence for the people that they come into contact with or for the living systems to which they belong. And I'm part of those people. I'd like to talk a little bit about what it means to be human, or as we understand ourselves as human. Because for thousands of years, it's no secret that people have lived under an ethic of living in accordance with an ethics that to be alive is to be revered and not reduced, manipulated, or used to the advantage of some over the cost or the expense of nearly everyone or everything. You needn't go too far. As I mentioned, 200 species go extinct, but we don't always see this. You needn't go too far to witness or even enact any violent atrocity born of the understanding that to be human is to be separate and to superior to everything else. But this is not how all humans understand existence. And so what lies before us is ethics, hope, and choice. Ethics that we can respond to the unjust suffering. Hope that we can recognize there are other ways of understanding our existence as human. And choice that we can choose to engage how we identify ourselves and assume responsibility for how we care for one another and for our existence in a living system. And so what I'd like to talk about is understanding ourselves in this existence and how we can begin to move out of the isolation of existing or understanding our existence as an individual and relate to one another in a more ecological community, or recognize that we exist in an ecological. So I take a deep breath. And even if I'm all alone, I'm in relationship with a countless amount of other things, living things. And they provide me with life, and I'm engaged in that back and forth. And if I recognize those things and I situate that ethically in the choices I make when I reflect on the relationships that I have, then I'm given the opportunity to possibly recognize and foster a steward of care amongst what it means to exist in this world. And this is important. And I bring this up of importance because as an educator, what we are doing oftentimes is business as usual. What I mean by business as usual is kind of set forth with just kind of carrying out with what we do on a day-to-day basis. It's something that we learn. In fact, how we understand ourselves as human is something that we learn. It's culturally passed on. And it's assumed that it's just the way it is, that it's natural, that what we do and how we behave, and that some of these atrocities that we enact or witness are just happening naturally. They're just part of what we might call progress. But all of this is culturally constructed, and it emerges from a particular place in a particular time that we might be interested in. In fact, many of us are very interested in this. So mass migration of mammals, a mass migration of humans, that for about 500 years or so have been spreading this idea that to be human is to be separate and superior to everything else. And if we understand ourselves as separate and superior to everything else, then everything we come into relationship, it's placed in a value hierarchy of being able to possibly be exploited or used for our own gain and then justified. And so as an advocate or as someone who really likes to identify or works on social justice issues and also recognizes and works on just issues of environmental degradation I see these two things, and I'm not alone in this by any means. As I mentioned before, people for thousands of years have lived according to this ethic. But what it means is that there's some really simple but yet complicated premises that exist that prohibit us from really getting at the roots of being able to solve issues of social justice and issues of environmental degradation. Some say, and I think they have just cause to say this, our survival as a species really depends on this. I have great hope, again mentioning the thousands of years of people who have lived in a different accordance of what it means to be human, that our survival does depend on changing, but that we have this capacity to change. And as an educator, that education can play a significant role in this. Because everything we do when we relate to one another, we're passing on ways of understanding the world through our languaging process, not just through our words, but through the interactions we have with one another. And so when we pass these things on, oftentimes we don't think about what we are passing. And as an educator who likes to think that ethics plays a primary role in what we do when we relate to one another, I think it's really important that we slow down, stop, rethink, and reconnect with what it is we are passing on to one another when we communicate, when we relate to one another. And not just when we relate to each other as humans, but when we're relating and recognizing the relationships that we have with everything around us. So I'll borrow a phrase, some wording from David Abram, refers to all of the things around us, specifically all of the living things around us, as the more than human world. And we begin to think of something as agents of change. Humans, we have great capacity to rethink these relationships, to learn from each other, from people who have really deeply rooted practices that they pass on about understanding their identity as humans and their personhood and relationships to one another in accordance with what many are calling an ecological community. The set of all of the relationships, the more than human world and the human world. Not as humans and everything else, but as all the living relationships, the ecological community, the one that we belong to. And so, for many of us, myself included, those seemingly sane people who yet time after time sort of keep finding hope in these models of infinite growth, limitless technology, right? An undying sort of belief in a universalizing understanding that to be, alive is to seek progress. And then we start talking about the potential future, and a lot of shock factor comes in, and that, there's this sort of intellectual nihilism that comes about. It's human nature, right? But if we see ourselves as part of a larger system, right, an ecological community, it changes the way we begin to see these problems of how we treat one another and how we relate to the natural world. For far too long, maybe, and I'll be a little bit picky about this, for 500 years, give or take 100 years on that, to be human has been primarily to be separate and superior to everything else, at least for those in power and for those writing what that universal understanding of what it means to be human is. It's been to be separate and superior. To get technical about it, we can fall back on the idea of the Cartesian I, the individual. None of us are individuals. That doesn't mean that we're not unique and we're not all of equal value and we all bring really wonderful different ideas and different thoughts and different looks and different things to each other and to the magic of what it means to be in place and in relationship with one another. But that none of us are individual. Even when we're alone, we're in relationship with not only each other and the past and potentially the future, but also with all of the more than human things that we come into interaction with. And so we have this idea for a really long time passed on through our language and how we act and how we behave and what we accept, witness, and enact that says we exist as independent, right? Business as usual. To be successful, you go to school, you get a job, to be independent. But what does independent mean? Because none of us are independent. We're all dependent on each other. on the past, on the future, and on the more than human world. And our language and our day-to-day practices and what we teach our children has everything to do with our ability to see that dependency. Gregory Bateson says if we strip back all of the language, what I mean by the language is like all of the words we use to describe something. I'm talking right now, but if we were to translate this into its raw form, it would sound like this. Dependency, dependency, dependency. Dependency, dependency, dependency. Dependency, 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 dependency. Oh, the dependency. Dependency. And that would be kind of what it sounds like for us humans that use our vocal cords to make noises, but that when I'm walking past a plant that's providing me with oxygen and I'm providing it with carbon dioxide, right? And we're doing the things we do, cell respiration and photosynthesis and all this stuff we like to call it, dependency, 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 that we are in a valuable relationship with one another. We don't exist in that false idea, that really problematic false idea where it's all about me, what I think, what I feel. It's like hyper-selfishness, and it's a setup that we find ourselves trapped in. If we begin to consider ourselves, and it's not easy, right? Easier said than done because it's so ingrained. It's like 500 years deep in mainstream, in manstream, in white stream culture. It's ingrained in the behaviors and the habits. We can interrupt that. In fact, as humans, we have the ethical capacity to say, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be this way. There's nothing that really says I'm all that much more important than everything else. In fact, there's a lot of stuff that says if I continue to behave as though I'm more important than everything else, more deserving of everything else, and I can do whatever I want with everything else, that my grandchildren's 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 children might not be here. Nah, they'll be here. But they might look back on now and say, what were you doing? Talking on that cell phone. And I talk on cell phones, so I'm not preaching. It's a dilemma that we're in. What were you doing when 200 species were going extinct? How come I can't drink the water or swim in the places that you could swim? We look at a lot of the things that have happened over the past, and we can reconnect, and we can stop, and we can evaluate. And it's my belief that if we educate ourselves and each other and work in place, very locally, situation, because it's different everywhere, and reconnect and learn from the people and from the other more than human things, our position and our place, that we can really begin to collectively solve a lot of the world's problems, starting very local.